Welcome to Wild and Exposed, your number one adventure, nature, and outdoor photography podcast. Wild and Exposed is hosted by Mike Mauro, Ron Hayes, and Jason Loftus. Thanks for tuning in.
Okay, so a couple weeks ago, we got into exposure, and we kind of talked about how we expose for, specifically in that podcast, we talked about exposing for subjects that are on snow and how we go about doing that. And we got some good feedback on that podcast. So tonight, we wanted to talk a little bit about composition, because we always get questions about, how do you set your images apart? And one of the ways that you can set your images apart quickly is by learning to compose in an artistic manner. It's a lot easier for a still image. Video, you're basically photographing motion, and things are going to change, and you can't always move the camera when you're or taking some video. So we'll talk about still images first, and then Mike can jump in and give us some tips on composing for your video to make that stand out as well. And I think probably the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about composition with wildlife is talking about the rule of thirds. But again, it's not necessarily a rule. There are times where you want to break it. But as we get into that, and we've talked about this before, and you can even put an overlay on your viewfinder on some cameras where you have it broken up in thirds. So you kind of want to imagine your subject on one of those thirds. And with wildlife, a lot of times you don't want them necessarily centered. And I can think of several instances where, you might, but a lot of times you want them off to either the right or left. Sometimes top, you're going to use that top and bottom third, depending on what the scenario is. But you want to get that animal on one of the thirds, either right or left third, looking into the scene. So you're kind of giving them space to basically give the viewer the opportunity to imagine what is going on in front of them, what they're looking at, where their attention is. That's one of the things that immediately comes to mind that I see from people that can be fixed right now. A lot of, images that people post, you're just not giving them any space, or the photographer is afraid to utilize that negative space. There's just nothing going on, so it doesn't seem interesting, and yet it can add to your image. What's the first thing you guys think of when you talk about composition?
The first thing that came to mind when you were sitting there talking about this was, trying to do it in camera so I don't have to crop as much. But you can crop, right? You can crop your composition and make up for some of the mistakes or the lack of thought in the field, if you will. And then when you spoke about that graph that has the thirds in it, you can do that in camera. I think you actually can do that in Lightroom too, until you kind of get used to the feel of it, right? So you can use that as a tool to try to, get your eye used to it if you're not used to it already. But yeah, for me, a lot of times I find myself not just using the top or the side. I find myself picking corners, and I love the crop of a 16:9. I don't know why. A lot of my images it's just what appeals to me. I like that longer feel. I don't know. It just works for me. So anytime I get a chance, that's kind of my go-to crop. And when I'm doing that, I like it. If, for example, if it's an elk bugling and he's looking into the scene, and I'll crop it that 16:9 so that he's looking into the scene and have him on that bottom left corner, if you will, looking to the right, and giving it some space there to create some drama or whatever, And for me, when I think of cropping, you mentioned the rule of thirds, and it is not a rule, right? There's a lot of times you would break it. But what I've learned is I used to really worry about that at first when I first started, doing this. I've learned, I think, to not be so concerned about that and just kind of trust my eye and just kind of trust when I'm playing with it, what looks good to me, what feels good to me. And there's been times where I've tried crops and it just doesn't work. And there's been times when it's like, wow, that even though it's breaking the rule, it really seems to work. For whatever reason, it feels good. It looks good, So I don't know. That's what comes to my mind off the top of my head.
Peter McKinnon did a really good video. So you were talking about the Lightroom overlays.
Uh-huh.
He did a really good video on some tricks in Lightroom, 10 tips specifically for Lightroom. And one of the things that he talked about was the overlays. And we'll put a link to in the show notes to that video, because I think he does a really good job of just demonstrating not only the tips that he's showing, but he also demonstrates the shortcuts so you can expedite your workflow when you start to become more proficient with those shortcuts. But there's a complexity to the rule of thirds. And I don't want to get into that. That's not what we're going to talk about tonight. But there's also what's called the golden spiral. And that's probably more realistic. And when you look at some of those images like you're talking about, that just kind of feel good to your eye, put them up against, use that golden spiral, which is in Lightroom. It's one of the overlays that you can use. And 9 times out of 10, when I have a shot like you're explaining or describing right now, 9 times out of 10, when I put that golden spiral on, it just fits. Everything is just brought to that center. And that's kind of what leading lines is another thing. Yeah. So if you've got something that leads into your subject, whether it's a fence or whether it's striation in the rock, whether it's a mountainside that's kind of coming down, leading into where your subject is, that horizon line, utilizing leading lines, a lot of times it makes the composition for you. It adds to it. So that's another thing that I'll do. And a lot of times when you look at that golden triangle, that's you want to lead into your golden spiral, not triangle. Do not go to the golden triangle. It's leading. Everything's leading into that central subject or leading into that subject's eye or behavior, whatever the case may be.
Well, if you watch that video that you're referencing with Peter, you can just toggle when you get the thirds up in Lightroom. And I don't know what the key is, but you can just toggle through, and it gives you all kinds of different little overlays that
it gives you
allows
those
you how to dial that in. So just watch that video and you'll pick up on it really fast, and you can figure out how that works. But what we need to talk about, and I think the biggest culprit, the biggest reason why composition is done after the fact and not necessarily done in the camera, is I don't think enough people are moving their focus point around. So if you just are leaving that focus point in the center and you are relying 100% on autofocus, your image is always going to be center punch. Whatever you're shooting is center. And that's fine if you're tight on an image. If you're shooting a portrait of anything, dead center is fine. It works. But if you are out of ways and you've got a scene going on, 8 times out of 10, you don't want that thing dead centered. It's just going to look funny. And all you have to do is get in the habit of moving that focus point around. Then your autofocus still works, because I think that's the problem, right? I don't think people just like punch autofocus, boom, I got it sharp, take the picture, and everything's going to be dead center. And I'll fix that when I get back and do it in Lightroom. I'm moving that focus point as much as I'm hitting autofocus. When I'm shooting an image, that focus point is going all the time. And I've just got so in tune with it. And in fact, I like the Sony system so much better than the Canon system, because the Canon, you have to activate that focus point. So you have to hit a button, then you can go toggle and move it around. Whereas with the Sony, you can toggle that focus point at any time. You don't have to go hit another button to activate it, which saves you a millisecond. The people that have to hit the button and then go move their focus point, that millisecond could miss that shot of that pika running over the tundra with a mouthful of hay or whatever. I mean, it's so critical. And I think there's just not enough people that move that thing around and compose your shot by doing that. And there's several ways to do it. We've talked a lot on this podcast about back button focus and shutter button focus. And I think Mark and Chaz, if you guys remember back to those episodes, Chaz was a shutter button focuser. And I've never been that. I've always been the back button. But you look at the logic behind the shutter button, to me, that makes more sense. It's faster. So if you are a prolific shooter and you're just constantly trying to move that focus point around, it's much better to have your finger on the trigger all the time, that focus is being engaged, and then you're still moving your focus point. Whereas if you're a back button focuser, you can't move that focus button around because you got to hit the back button focus, right? So to me, that's the biggest culprit. And I think if you're going to miss shots in the beginning to figure it out. But if you figure it out, you're going to be so much happier. And it's so much easier to compose that based on the rule of thirds or based on your spiral, golden spiral or whatever you said, golden triangle.
Don't get that stuck in my head, or it'll be all night.
The other thing that I had to add to that was composition depends on what you're shooting for too, right? If you want to make it in the editorial world, let's say you want to sell the magazines, there's a bunch of different compositions that you're constantly got to be paying attention to. If you want a cover shot, you're going to have to shoot vertical. Well, nowadays you may not have to, because these cameras are so good now that you can actually crop a vertical out if you wanted to, because the file sizes are so big. It's best if you go vertical and then you compose that shot, but you're thinking about the masthead. You're thinking about the title of the magazine. You're thinking about the left side or the right side where they might put all the little things in the magazine that are going to appear, all the articles. So you got to kind of compose for that. If you're looking for an inside shot, let's say you want to sell a picture to the inside of a magazine where it's running 2 pages. A double truck is what they call it. If you want to do that, sometimes you want to break that rule of thirds, or not necessarily break the rule of thirds, but oftentimes we'll talk about an animal looking into the frame. They want to look where there's space. You want to see where that animal's looking. So you want to see if an animal's looking right to left. On the left side, you're leaving a bunch of space open so the viewer can see what that animal's looking at. But if you're going to do a double page spread, it may not matter which way the animal's looking, because all that open space that's left open might be where the article goes or where all the text goes. So composition is a total different thing there. So you really got to kind of figure out what you're shooting for. If you're shooting for a really pretty picture on the wall, rule of thirds is the way to go. If you're going to try to make it in the editorial world, which is kind of dying off, but then so let's take it one step further. Let's say editorial is dying off and there's not as many sales that you can make in that world these days. We're still dealing with web banners and all these little ads that you see on the web, and there's all these common sizes that people use images for. So then you got to start looking at those images that appear on web pages and you say, okay, well, I need to shoot this in this way. And Jason, what you were talking about with that long, skinny panorama type feel, that works. That's very appealing for someone on a web page, right? Because they can fill a lot of space on the top of the page. So just think about that kind of stuff when you're composing images too, because it really depends.
So real quick, I'll just add, thinking about your shot, right? I mean, you're right, 100%. I've got a good example of that. So I started working with a guy, it's Cirrus Gear, and he makes gun mats. And we worked on some wildlife images for those gun mats, and it was kind of a cool little project. And the trick was, I'm trying to remember the actual crops, but I think he needed images that were cropped like 14 by 48, right? Because he's making basically it's a mouse pad material, but it's the full length of a rifle or a shotgun. So you can lay your weapon down on there and have it be cushioned and while you're cleaning and stuff, right? And so when I first started working with him, it was just like going through my images and trying to find ones that I could crop that way that would work. But then as I worked with him for a year or two, as I was out in the field, I found myself thinking about that and looking at that crop thinking, oh, here's an opportunity. I can, that would be perfect crop for that kind of a mat or something, right? And then I find myself thinking about crops for calendars because I do some calendar work. And I find myself thinking about crops for covers, on and on and on, right? So it's crazy, all the thought process has to go in. And I guess my point was just going to be, and you said it basically, right, Mike? But you got to go into the field, not just thinking about your crops, but thinking about the images you want to get. And I know it's been talked about before, but that is so super critical. If you're just going out there blasting away and spraying and praying, you might end up with a couple of good shots, a couple of good images. But, if you're more intentional, you can walk away from a shoot with multiple different crops of the same image, even potentially, that'll all work for different scenarios, and that's, where you can be more value added to different media.
Yep.
And that's where I was going to go next. Mark used to always talk about working the situation, working the scenario.
Yes.
I know we've talked about this, but this fits right into the composition subject that we're talking about, or topic that we're on, is change your composition. So once you've got the shot, don't take 400 more of the same shot. Switch it up, zoom out, create more space, look right, look left. If you're shooting horizontal, switch to vertical, create some different things for yourself. If you're fortunate enough to have that pika that's loping through the rock slide with the hay or better yet, wildflowers in its mouth. And it keeps coming back out to the same spot to gather more and going back in. So you have time. You have time to shoot this thing every way you can possibly imagine. So make sure that you're doing that. You're not just sitting in the same spot. You know, it doesn't matter how experienced you are. You can get sucked into this. Sit in the same spot, same composition, you know, maybe waiting for different light, that kind of thing. But you don't have to move far. Move 6 feet. Just get a different angle. Change your perspective. If you're shooting at, you know, below eye level, try to work into a position where you can get at eye level or maybe a little bit above. You don't want to, I don't like shooting down on subjects too much, especially something small like the pika or waterfowl, that kind of thing, because you kind of take away from your subject. Make sure that you're varying things up. You're not just shooting the same thing over and over and over again. Otherwise, you're going to go home with the same shot and you're going to end up deleting 1,000 good images when you could have had, you know, 200 to select from, 4 or 5 different angles or crops or scenes.
If you're going to key in on one thing that you just said, Ron, I think that the number one thing there is, well, there's more than one, but the other thing that people don't do is, where are you going to shoot? You need to be below that animal. You need to be below their eyes. So if you're shooting a coyote, you should be laying on the ground. If you're going to shoot a bear, and it's hard, some of the, you know, when you're shooting a predator, it's not like you can go crawling around on the ground and stuff, but try to put yourself in those positions. Or if you see a bear that's walking in this direction and you see a hill off over there and you think, oh, that bear might come up and over that hill. If you can scoot down wherever you need to be to shoot up towards the bear, that's going to be a way better shot than if you're, you know, just trying to follow this bear and you're shooting a side profile shot and it's just nothing that's really appealing to people. So think about that too. And it doesn't matter if it's an elk, if it's a predator, if it's a pika. If I'm going to shoot a pika, I want my camera laying on the ground. You know, I'm going to be shooting profile, just laying flat as I can get with probably a big lens and just looking at those little pathways where you said, Ron, they lope along, you know, and you're just going to key in on those spots where you can just get right down on that level. Same with ducks, same with waterfowl. It's that you take an image of a duck where you're standing up and you're shooting onto the water, and then take that same image of that same duck. If you can get right down on water level, night and day difference. And you'll just be totally blown away by what you get if you can get on that level of whatever you're shooting.
Some good examples of this, and I'll give him a shout out, but Jamin Hunter, I think it's just Jay Hunter on Instagram. Look at some of his waterfowl work, and there's a lot of good photographers out there, but he's got some loon shots that he's right down at water level, and just the difference that makes in an image is night and day. It sets you apart from, you know, elite, or if you're on a 1 to 10 system, from being a 10 to a 4 or 5, just kind of an also ran. And I think that's important with waterfowl, but like you were talking about with predators and small mammals also.
Right. The other thing that I would add is a complete other end of the spectrum. It's not bad to go complete artsy-fartsy either, right? So if you can totally break all the rules and you can end up with a kind of a cool shot, but it's not going to really have a purpose. I don't know. What would you say? It could be something that captures somebody's imagination more than anything. And those images kind of work, you know, but that's breaking every rule that we're talking about out there. It's like, you're not doing rule of thirds. You're not, you know, it's just, it's different all the way around, but that's a style. So then this composition becomes a stylistic kind of thing. And I know photographers out there that, you know, pros that make their living just by being different like that, because everybody is so accustomed to seeing the same thing. You know, we all see an elk on the side of the road. We probably all have the same image in our mind. Oh, I got to get that shot. And we all get it. Well, what's going to set you apart from everybody else that's there? You need to start thinking different. So maybe it is doing something completely out of the norm. Or I think, Jason, you talked about it the other day. Did we talk about that the other day, where you have too big of a lens and the animal gets closer and closer and closer, and it's the crops that you end up having to do just because out of necessity, because, well, okay, I'm going to get this eyeball and this part of the antler and maybe half of the nose, and hopefully that works, but that is probably going to be something that's your own, and not a lot of other people have that shot at that moment. So compositionally, that works. But there's no right or wrong to any of this. It's just get good at the rules and then figure out how to break them in a creative way.
To move on to another thing, and this does turn into more of an artistic feel, is learning to frame your subject. And you can use trees, you can use rocks. I got an image last spring. We were up in Colorado, central Colorado, photographing mountain goats, and the clouds are just going crazy. And so these goats kind of bailed off this cliff face and then worked down this ridge line. So you're shooting way downhill. So it's not typically a shot that I would spend much time trying to work with. But all of a sudden the clouds started moving thick, and this circle of clouds kind of started to come around this mountainside and kind of run down this point. And I could see, as I'm looking down the hill, I could see that circle is going to come right over the top of this goat who was standing kind of looking off into the valley. And so I just waited and waited and waited. And right when that circle opened up over the top of that goat, so the goat is framed in that circle of clouds. I'm shooting downhill, but it didn't matter with this shot because, number one, the light was crazy. And number two, those clouds had it framed perfectly. And the full cloud was in the frame of the composition. So you could kind of see what was happening. And so that kind of made the shot. But I see people use trees a lot, even, like driftwood. And you kind of position yourself to where you're shooting through the driftwood, and the driftwood might be close enough that it's not going to be in focus at all. You can't even really tell what it is necessarily, but it frames your subject, and it basically just gives people no way to misinterpret what the main subject of your image is. It just draws attention right to it. And so using those framing elements, I think, too, can be a good compositional tip. And I know you guys both do that often, but...
Yeah, I think that fits with that golden circle, not circle, spiral.
Spiral, yeah.
Golden spiral concept, right? I mean, it really does. I think I like it. I think it's unique. I try to do it as much as I can. Sometimes it works well. Sometimes I've tried it multiple times, and it just doesn't look good to me. But it's always fun to try, right? Back to our whole original conversation of just try different things, try different compositions. On that Yellowstone trip on the coach, I actually had that with a coyote, and there was a tree. The coyote was on the side of a hill, and I got plenty of images of him on the hill, laying in the snow, standing up, blah, blah, blah. So I figured, you know what, I'm just going to take a minute. There's this pine tree here. I'm going to try to go get around there and try to frame him with this pine tree, to your point, Ron. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't tell it was a pine tree from, because it was so close and it was blurry. And those are the images that I said actually didn't work. But why not try, right? You're there. You got the time. If things are there, you've got the shots you want. Start being real creative, man. Do something different, like you said, Mike.
Yep.
It's a good time to do it. And you never know unless you try. So you'll never know. You'll never start figuring out the things that work well and the circumstances that you were in that lent themselves to work well unless you start trying that stuff and seeing what your results are.
Yeah, and I think those circumstances that you're talking about occur quite a bit. So if you can figure out what those are, and you have it happen this day, and then the next day, different animal, different topography, but same set of circumstances, and that turned out pretty cool. I'm going to try it here. You just got to keep doing it. Just give it a go. And
just real quick before, I know you have another point to make, Mike, but I'm a back button guy, and when I actually listened to the podcast, when you guys were talking about, using the focal point instead of using the back button and going back to, I was like, this is insane. These guys, no, I just barely got used to shooting with my back button, and I love it. I love the freedom of being able to just leave my focus button in the center. I compose, hit my focus button, compose, and shoot. It works beautiful, and it does work for the most part. But when stuff starts getting crazy, I guess what I'm learning is that that's when it matters, because when things start to go down fast. Now all of a sudden you find yourself, all you're doing is centered, and your animal's in the center, and you're just blasting away because you have to be in order to be focused. So back to that original topic of composition, I'm learning that it's really important that maybe that's a better way to shoot, because now I can. And why does it matter? Why does it matter if with these cameras have such big sensors and so many megapixels now? Why don't I just crop after? But your mindset should be to try to get that in camera, and the less you have to crop after, the more you nail it up front, the more data you have in your image, and the larger you can print your file, and so on and so forth, right? So I think that's why it kind of matters. Plus, I think it really forces you to be more creative in the field. And I think my goal is to try to get as much as I can right in camera in the field, so I have as little or less work to do in post. So I don't know, just some of my thoughts that I was thinking about as we talked about. So I've been thinking more and more about, using that, moving my point around more than I have been in the past. But
Most cameras you can set up both ways, Jason. So you can have your shutter actuator. You can have that release set to focus, but you can also have your back button set to focus. And so you can do it both ways. Now, if you use your back button, then that locks focus, so you can recompose.
Yeah.
If you use your shutter release, you release it, you are going to have to focus again. But I think you kind of hit on it. The reason that I use the toggle is because, number one, you want to get it right in camera. Number two, you are losing focus.
Yeah.
If that subject moves, if you've focused and recomposed, and now all of a sudden the subject turns and is coming toward you,
yeah,
you've lost the focal plane. So you've got to reacquire and do everything all over again.
So that's when you panic and center it and just blast away. Yeah, sorry.
Right.
And you crop in the computer. You just like, I'll fix it in
and then
post.
You crop in the computer and go, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. The way I approached that, because I was always a back button person too. And I think it was because these older cameras, it was either or. It wasn't you could have both. Now the newer cameras, you can have both. So when I picked up that Sony last summer, just to try it out, I left that camera with the trigger, or the, what'd you call it, the shutter actuation
shutter
button,
release, shutter actuator
thingy-ma-doody.
Yeah.
So I left it. So I've gotten used to on the Sony just doing that. I haven't switched my Canon over to it yet, but I think I will. As far as video, I don't know. You guys want to go any further on the still stuff? I don't have anything else to add.
No, I was just going to ask you what, video-wise, what suggestions do you have?
So for video, you always got to look at it as telling a story, right? If I think I'm rolling into a situation where I'm going to have a little bit of time, the first thing is I'll get the subject and I'll try to get it tight and I'll try to get that portrait shot, because that's going to be the focal of this whole little story. Is I just got to kind of show this animal as close and as pure as I can show it, using the same compositional structure that I would use in a still image. And then after that, what I'll do is you got to think wide, medium, and tight. And then you've got to think about other storytelling elements. You got to think about transitions. You got to think about all these different things that come into play because you're not going to rely on just one image. You're going to rely on a bunch of one images to kind of put it all together to show people, this is what we saw, this is what went down, this is how the animal acts. I'll get the wide shot, so I want to put that animal in perspective. And sometimes it's kind of hard, right? Because if you just have one lens on your video camera, chances are I'm going to have a zoom. But I'll get as wide as I can. I'll show as much habitat, and it might be just a little small animal in the frame. And I'll shoot it where I'll just be stationary and just let it be. Then I might just do a pan from left to right, especially if the animal's steady. If it's staying in one spot, I might left justify the animal, and then I'll pan to the left, and then right justify the animal, all in the same shot. Then I'll go for my medium shot, and I'll do a bunch of different variations. This is all if you got time, right? This is why wildlife video is so hard. And when you watch a program like Planet Earth, where you're just so blown away, you're like, how did they do that? It's just so much time, because a lot of times with wild animals, you just don't have a lot of time. Now, if you're shooting a big, if you're shooting elk in the rut, chances are you're going to have time, just because there's so many elk and there's so many situations, and you can do it for 3 or 4 or 5 days, and you're probably going to get enough to put everything together to tell a really good story. But you think wide, you think medium, you think tight. Then once you have all that, then let's say the animal's walking. Well, sometimes I want to follow it walking, but sometimes I'm just going to focus on the hooves, just because I want to see how they walk, because that's part of that story. And then I'm going to just shoot just their head, and are they moving around, or their ears moving around? I'm telling that this is a lot of stuff to get in a short amount of time. And then the other thing you want to do is, a lot of times what you find with people brand new to video cameras is it's just that camera's on and it's moving all the time. It's just constantly like following whatever it is following. Sometimes you just want to start, and you might start panning with an animal if it's walking, but at a certain point you want to stop the camera and you can let that animal walk right out of the frame. And what that does is it provides a cut point to go to that next shot. Because a lot of times you'll have, if they're walking and you're just following it and panning and panning and panning, what's the transition? How can you get a transition out of that shot to the next shot? So, I mean, there's just way more than this. These are just like little basics, but you can see that there's just a lot of stuff to think about. And then, nowadays on Instagram, if you're going to throw up a little video, you got 60 seconds to tell that story and try to put in that 60 seconds, you got to be able to show as much as you can. And it takes a lot.
Right. Agreed. That's the most difficult thing for me as I try to do more and more video. I get myself stuck in, I kind of get myself stuck in that same rut that you get stuck in with a shot. If you've got a great shot, a great composition, great behavior going on, it's hard to get yourself to shoot vertical instead of horizontal, or it's hard to get yourself to change that composition at all because you're worried you might, miss something else. And with video, it's hard to break myself away from having that whole animal in the scene, or even a little bit wider to show the environment. But it's hard for me to focus in on that small detail and so a lot of times I'll miss that as part of that storytelling element. And it's no different with stills.
Yeah.
You have to work the scene, get everything.
One little trick that I do, if I know I'm only going to have so much time with this animal and I'm going to try to get as much as I can, I'll get as many of those elements, a wide, a medium, a tight, some really super tights to highlight parts of the animal. If I can get all that and then it's over with, that's when I'll go get all these little pickups. If I want to show that the wind was blowing, I'm going to go over and shoot some grass or some flowers that are fluttering in the wind. Or if I want to show that there were tons of mosquitoes and these animals are just dealing with all these other elements in their world, I'll try to find a little, massive mosquitoes flying around and get the right light so that you can see them. Or I might, just all those little elements that don't necessarily need to be shot right when you're shooting whatever you're shooting, but you just got to make these mental notes that, oh, this would be great to help tell this story. Or, shoot a stream to show if you've got, you have to enter into this whole other world of audio with video too, right? And audio tells just as much of the story as the video does. So now you're paying attention to that. And let's say we had a situation where we're shooting moose earlier this year, and this moose walks down and crosses a river. Well, I know I have to get audio for that river, and I should probably get some close-ups of just the water and just try to show people how deep it was, or if it was cold, is it coming out of a glacier, or is it coming just out of a spring, or what is the deal? And, there's all these other little things that you're just constantly making mental notes. And sometimes you don't need to even do that same day. If you're working on a project, you might be in a place for a week. Just keep those mental notes there, and you can think back to, oh, that bear was in that similar kind of tree or habitat. I'm going to shoot just little elements of that habitat that help me tell this story later when I go put this together in an edit. So
the problem is I have to take those mental notes and get them down somewhere else because my mental note keeper is not what it once was.
I know. It's so hard. I can't tell you how many times you get back and you think, oh, I got so much cool stuff and I'm going to tell this really great story. And there's always those 1 or 2 or 3 shots that you miss. So I'll end up going into the files. And fortunately, I've been shooting long enough where I can probably find, something, a bird on a branch or something just to cut to that's just a little different. But it's true to that scene, or it's true to what was happening. It just may not have happened when I was shooting it. And it's almost impossible unless you got 3 or 4 camera people that are shooting. If that's the situation, if you got 3 or 4 people, we do it all the time on these commercial shoots where I'll look at, some of the crew and I'll be like, okay, you're shooting wide, you're shooting tight. I'm going to take all the action. And then this person, you focus in on the audio. And then if we're limited on time, that's how we do it. and then we know we've just got it. And then it cuts together so much easier too, because it's all congruent, right? But there's a million ways to skin the cat, and you just got to figure out what works for you. But for what we're doing and for today's world and for people that are just getting into it, I mean, if you can just get that one killer shot, what I would say is just treat it just like a still. And I think I've said it on this podcast before. Still shooters that turn into videographers are always way better than videographers that try to turn into a still shooter. So I think if you come with a good base and you come with the ability to compose something in a still image and tell that story in one single frame, you're going to be way better at shooting video than someone that's trying to go the other way. And like I said, for today's world, if you're going to throw up a really cool little video chunk, it's fine on Instagram. You don't need all those other little elements. You don't need to tell this whole other story. You can just tell a cool little story. A cool little 30-second clip of a pica would be awesome. You know, and it's probably something that a lot of people have never seen before.
Yeah, I know for me, I'm just pushing that record button. But right now I've got a lot to learn when it comes to the video. But I will say there's another supporting reason to move that toggle around and try to crop or try to get your composition right in camera, because you got a lot less opportunity to do that with video after the fact, right?
Right.
So if you want to make at some point make that transition and or learn how to do that, then even better to be thinking that way and not rely on your post processing to crop your images, because you'll have that eye when you start doing video too. So
yeah. Now, the one difficult thing about shooting video, number one, you always got to have a tripod, which that eliminates a huge part of the still shooters out there, because the trend now is to not use a tripod. So a lot of people are out there and, you know, they're just hand holding. And that generally doesn't work. Sometimes if you're really good and you're really steady and the wind's not blowing and blah, 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 and you got a really good camera with a good vibration reduction system in it, you might get something that's usable. But number one, you got to have a tripod. And then the other thing that's bad about shooting, or different about, it's not bad at all. The difference about shooting stills and video is you're not shooting for composition through a viewfinder or an eyepiece. Now you're using the back of the camera. So then it's a whole nother thing, because you're going to probably use autofocus in most cameras. And then you're tapping on that screen to kind of set where the autofocus is at. So sometimes it's a little easier to compose on the back of the screen with just touching the screen where you want the focus to hit. You know, you don't have to be moving your toggle switch around to get that focus point where you want it to go. With video, you just touch the screen. The problem with wildlife is those autofocus systems are working on contrast. And a lot of times there's not enough contrast with the brown bear with brown trees and brown grass. And, you know, you'll have that problem where it's searching for focus. So then you got to go to manual focus, flip it to manual focus, and try to dial it in as best you can. And that's hard to do. So it's a different mindset, but if you follow all those suggestions and you've got time, once you've accomplished everything with stills, that might be the time to flip it over to video and run 3 or 4 clips of video.
That's what I've been doing. I just try to do that as much as possible when I'm in the field, you know, just try to always get a little bit of video of everything that I'm experiencing, that, you know, and just play with it, learn. That's how you learn, right? That's how I learned photography was getting out and doing it. So that's how I'm going to learn how to do video too, obviously, with, you know, with help from other people, obviously that helps too. But, you know, it really is just a mindset difference too, right? Shooting video. And you guys have talked about it multiple times, but I'm blown away at the mindset difference it is to shoot video. It's just such a different mindset. I mean, you know, the mechanics are very similar and all those kinds of things. And when you understand the basics of a camera and how to, you know, push the record button and how to compose, I think, you know, it helps a ton. But even then, like you said, just trying to get all the pieces of the puzzle and tell the whole story, you know, you're trying to do that with an image, you know, when you're taking stills. With a video, it's a whole nother ball game, boy. It's just amazing to me how much of a mindset shift it is to do video. So the little bit I've tried to do it, it's just, like I said, I'm just basically pushing play right now, or pushing record right now. So
well, and I think that's valuable to be able to do that, right? Because you still might get something that is just so awesome that why not shoot it?
I think that comment definitely needs to needs to be heard. And the other issue with that is, not only do you have to tell the story with a single image, but we're talking about, most people are seeing these images on Instagram or on social media, and you've done well if you can captivate somebody's attention for a couple seconds. And now you look at telling that story with video, and not only do you have to catch their attention to begin with, but you've got to captivate or capture that attention for a minute, or in some of these shows for 30 minutes. And that's why, Planet Earth or Blue Planet, or you think about, any of these Nat Geo shows, if you look at it, I mean, these guys have conquered the world because they are capturing your attention not only for the hour that you're watching, but they're also leaving you thirsty for more. And they always leave me, wanting to be in those situations. And I think that's when you're dealing with a good videographer, when they can capture you, take you there, keep you there, and then make you hungry enough to want to go see it for yourself.
If anybody has, everybody has Netflix, or most everybody has Netflix. On Netflix, I think there's a program I think it's on Netflix. I think it's called, or I know it's called Our Planet. I don't know if you guys watch that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you sent me that, and that was.
So what I like watching more than that is I like watching the making of. And if you dig through, sometimes on Netflix, they'll put episodes and more. And it won't be listed. If you just watch all the episodes, which you got to watch and they're cool, but you're seeing all the perfect everything, right? But if you dig down through that episodes and more, you'll find the behind the scenes of Our Planet. That is so much fun for someone like me to watch, because I just want to see, how did they do that? What was the situation? How long did that person stay there? And they'll say, we sent this person here for 30 days or 45 days sitting in this little box because we were hoping we could get one shot of a tiger. It's amazing how much time. And those guys have the budgets to captivate us, and it works. And I think there's nothing more powerful than the natural world when it's done right.
The best way to learn is to do it. We've had multiple guests say that. We've all said it, and it really is true. Just get out and do it. So,
yep, I agree 100% with that.
That's a good wrap.
You've been listening to the Wild and Exposed podcast. If you haven't yet, please give us a rating and a review, and make sure you're subscribed so that you'll get every episode we produce as soon as we drop it. And as always, thanks for tuning in.
We got our windows down, driving down the 405, sing along to the radio. We're gonna make it someday, nothing's gonna get in our way. We will be the biggest band in town. Round and round the world we'll go.